Salve Tedeskipuli, and welcome to our first online note-taking session. What I'll be doing is holding up a series of notes, and you may or may not choose to write down what's on here. You might want to add some, you might want to not write everything, but I'll be holding up, the different key points that have to do with what I'm talking about. And I just want you to jot down, probably just in rough draft form, the main points, and then after, if you want to organize them into our standard note form we use in class, that is awesome. So the first topic we're going to be talking about is something called verb principal parts, and then we will be talking about something called the perfect tense. The perfect tense is one of the 4 tenses you learned last year in 7th grade, but you may not remember it, so we will be reviewing it. So first, let's start talking about the verb principal parts. When you look a verb up in your dictionary, there will typically be 4 forms. Sometimes there will just be 2, sometimes there will be 3, but most of the time there will be 4. The first form is generally going to end in the letter O. Not always, but usually. The second form is going to end in the letters R-E. The third form is going to end in the letter I. And the fourth form is going to end in the letter US. So that O, that RE, that I, and that US is a pretty typical pattern you can count on seeing. And they are known as the 4 principal parts of the verb. So when you hear me say principal parts, remember that I'm just giving a fancy way of saying it's just the different forms of the word in its dictionary entry. And they each have their own use. So let's take a look. The first principal part tends to end in the letter O, and it is the first person singular in the present tense. So it translates by itself. I love, for example. So it's happening right now because it's present tense, and it's I because it's first person singular. The second principal part, which again tends to end in an RE, is called the infinitive, and the infinitive translates with the word to in it. So to love in this example, portare would be to carry, audire would be to hear, and so on. The third principal part, again, it ends in an I, and it's also first person singular, but it's first person singular for the perfect tense instead of the present. So remember, our first principal part, which generally ended in an O, was first person singular for present, so we have I love. The third principal part is first person singular for perfect tense, so it would translate I loved. So that's the first 3 principal parts. We're not going to talk about the 4th one for now because you're not going to see it for quite a while. So again, just to summarize, what we just looked at are what are called principal parts. They are just the basic entry for a verb when you look it up in the dictionary, and each principal part is used for a specific thing having to do with the verb. See if you can remember what the first principal part is used for, the second principal part, and the third principal part. I'll check back in with you in a moment. Okay, so if you remembered that the first principal part is the first person singular in the present tense, you are correct. The second principal part, which tends to end in an RE, is known as the infinitive, and it translates with the word to in front of it. The third principal part ends in an I, and it is the first person singular in the perfect tense, and it would translate I loved. And again, we're not going to worry about the 4th principal part today. So that brings us to the next part of our notes, which is going to be on the perfect tense. First, I'm going to talk about how to form something called the perfect stem, which you need in order to do the perfect tense. So, in order to form the perfect stem, you're going to take the third principal part, which you guys know since you're experts from the notes a minute ago, ends in an I, and what you're going to do is you're actually going to take off that I, and whatever stem is left, that is known as the perfect stem. So if we had amawi, that's from the verb amo, amare, amawi. You take off the I, that's your perfect stem. Or we could have the verb debeo, debeo, debere, debui. We take off the I, that is our perfect stem. copio, copere, kepi. We take off the I, and that is our perfect stem. So we're going to need this perfect stem for the next step, so just take a minute and make sure you have that written down, that the perfect stem is the third principal part with the I taken off, nothing else. Once you have that perfect stem figured out, you're going to use it for the perfect tense, as well as a couple other tenses that we'll be learning about down the line. These are the endings that you're going to want to add, and you definitely want to write these down. So these endings just plug right on to the perfect stem, and they are I, isti, it, immas, istis, erant. I, isti, it, immas, istis, erant. And it works just the way all the other verb tenses do. So this would be your I, your you, your he, she, it, your we, your you all, and your they, just like any other tense that we've reviewed. I'm just going to give you a minute to make sure you have those endings written in. I, isti, it, immas, istis, erant. Perfect tense translates is just a regular old past tense. So I wrote an ed. So you could have like I jumped, I studied, I ate, I ran, whatever the verb is. It's just the basic past tense. You also can use the helping verbs has, have, or did. So I have studied, I did study. So any of those three ways translate for the perfect tense, all right? So I want you to take a minute in your notes and write down this example. Well, after you write down the three ways it translates, write down this example, ama wisti. And I want you to write how you think it should translate, and we will be right back. Okay, if you had a minute to think about it, hopefully you came to the conclusion that ama wisti, which is second person singular in the perfect tense, would translate you loved, you have loved, or you did love. So if you had anything else, I'm going to ask you to go into your notes and just adjust that for me now. Now, you had learned another past tense known as the imperfect tense, and you might be wondering how they differ in translation. Well, if I took that same verb and kept it second person singular but put it in the imperfect, we would have ama bas as opposed to ama wisti. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment and see if you can figure out how ama bas should translate, looking back in your imperfect notes if you have to. It is going to be a little bit different than how the perfect tense translates, so just take a moment for me and do that. Okay, hopefully you came up with one of these four. You were loving, you kept loving, you used to love, or you began to love. Those are the four ways imperfect translates, and that's review. The most common way is the was, were. Just to summarize so that you can double check your notes, this is what we went over tonight. We went over verb principal parts, and we talked about how when you look a verb up in the dictionary, there tend to be four forms known as principal parts. It tends to end in an O, an RE, an I, and a US, and again, those forms are called principal parts, and they each have their own use. So we talked about how the first principal part, which tends to end in an O, is I in the present tense. We talked about how the second principal part, which tends to end in an RE, is known as the infinitive, and it translates to whatever the verb means. We also talked about the third principal part, which is also I, except it's I in the perfect tense, so it would translate I loved as opposed to I love. We did not talk about the fourth principal part. Instead, we continued to talk about this particular principal part by talking about the perfect tense. We discussed how you form what is known as the perfect stem by just removing the I from the third principal part. So we would have, as examples, we would have amaw, debu, and kep. And those are what you would add the perfect tense endings to. which are as follows. So you just want to double check that you got these in your notes. Isti, it, immas, istis, and erunt. And again, it just works like I, you, he, she, it, etc., like any other verb tense. We talked about how it translates, 3 different ways that it sounds like it's in the past. And so amma wisti as an example would translate any of these 3 ways. And we talked about how this differs slightly from the imperfect tense, which is also a past tense. So amma bas, instead of translating the way perfect tense does, would be ever so slightly different, and it would translate one of these 4 ways. So go through your notes, make sure that you got all that information, and we will check in next class.